The CBS Sports poll came out with its top 25, as Steve reminded me before we started to record. Clemson number 1, Ohio State number 2. I have not looked past that. I believe Alabama would be number 3. Kevin, do you care about preseason polls?
As somebody who has to produce content, I love them. Love them. People stuff to talk about. What are they worth? Not much. I mean, we'll sit there and find, identify 6 teams in the top 25. Oh, they're just always overrated, and these 3 teams are underrated. But, conversation is good right now. I'm sick and tired of hearing about zinc and all these medicines I can't pronounce and whatnot, well above my pay grade. Do I put a lot in preseason polls? No, I don't put one together myself, just because I don't want to open myself up for all the grief that I give these polls that I see. But as for their 1, 2, I don't have a problem with it. You sit there and you want to say, well, the national champion needs to be given the consideration. LSU certainly has lost a lot. On that one specific day when Ohio State and Clemson played, Clemson was able to get away with the win. I'm okay with them being 1. Honestly, Ohio State's going to have some questions to answer or whatnot. And I bet you that the coaches would like to, keep the team a little bit hungry. They probably wouldn't mind seeing this team come in at about 7, to be quite honest, just so you haven't earned anything yet. Nothing's given to you at this point, and kind of go on from there.
I know I tracked this down for our site, the CBS top 10 that they think Clemson will be revealed number 1 today. It was Clemson 1, Ohio State 2, Alabama 3, Oklahoma 4. It seems like they're always stuck in that 4 spot and always get drubbed out the semifinals every year. Looks like it'll happen again this year. 5, Georgia, 6, Florida, 7, Oregon. Now, maybe Georgia or Florida, maybe one of them can jump up and beat Alabama this year. Hard to say. 7, Oregon, 8, LSU. I do expect them to fall back. 9, Penn State, 10, Notre Dame. Then some others, 12, Wisconsin, who Ohio State does not play. 13, Michigan. 16, Minnesota, who thankfully Ohio State does not play. We don't have to go to Minneapolis this year. 19,
always concerned with the trip itself, not the opponent.
There's a trip.
There's a reason we don't want to go to Minneapolis right now.
I like going to Minneapolis for a dinner at Hoyt's.
Yeah, which we hope is still there. So 19, Iowa, who they don't play. So Ohio State's really getting – well, they do play Iowa. That's their one tough crossover game, plus Nebraska. And then Cincinnati, we just throw him in here, Luke Fickell at 21. They are actually on here as the highest-rated group of 5, which means they would, like Memphis last year, they would get a spot in one of the big boy bowls to go against one of the major conference teams. So interesting. I think that's going to mimic what a lot of the bowls are going to, in a sense, going to have. And as I was looking up with Clemson, they lost T. Higgins, obviously. They lost Isaiah Simmons, the linebacker. Tanner Muse, the safety. Couple other one of their top offensive linemen is gone. But obviously they have Lawrence, the quarterback, ATN, the running back. Ross, I know he's been in the news with surgery or injury issue, one or the other. And then the third wide receiver, Rogers, he's back. So those big 4 are back, even though Higgins is gone. But they got to retool a little bit in the secondary. They lost some guys there. And Simmons was their best defensive player without a doubt. The defensive line was young, so they'll grow up a little bit. Got to replace 2 or 3 guys on the offensive line. So it helps that they don't play anybody in the ACC, although they will be playing Notre Dame and potentially North Carolina in the championship game, I guess. So I don't know. Interesting. That's probably how I'd have it. Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama right now.
Do we have an idea why? And I bring this up because I've been reviewing national championship races from the 80s and 90s, that at that time you would think that there would have been less parity in college football and there would be more today. But the 5 or 6 schools that Steve mentioned right off the top are the same 5 or 6 schools we've been talking about each and every year for now 5 to 6 years. Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, Georgia, Ohio State. And back then, my goodness, there was more like a pool of 15 to 20. And you had all sorts of teams jumping into the mix in the top 5 to 10 in the country on a given year in the 80s and 90s. It was just the wealth was spread so much more across the country.
With more scholarship players back then, is that correct?
Yes.
Like, say, Iowa when they were number 1 in 1985. Why? I think one reason is football styles were very, very similar. I don't know how it was. You're either wishbone or you're run heavy or you're BYU. I think there's fewer styles back then, and so maybe it just comes down to a little bit of execution, and you're not being put at a disadvantage in more ways like you are now. And defense is almost impossible now with that, all of the different offenses and the hybridization of so many different players. You start landing those guys, and now you're even better. Back then, there just weren't as many difficulties, I think, maybe, as there is now, which allowed more teams to contend. That's my theory.
It's a better one than I have.
I'll throw in, I guess, stability. Saban over a decade, Sweeney over a decade at Clemson, or right around a decade. Ohio State maybe has moved the coach around a little bit, Tressel, Fickle, Meyer, and now Day, but it's been consistently great head coaching for the last 18 years, 19 years, whatever, and great recruiters. I mean, the recruiting only got better when it went from Tressel top 10 to Meyer top 5 classes, so that wasn't a drop-off there. Michigan's been through, several coaches during this period. He spells Penn State, since Paterno left, went through a couple coaches, and then now Franklin's kind of settling in and building something there. Kelly is kind of finally settling in and building something at Notre Dame. They're picked in the top 10 again this year. So I think it kind of comes back to stability. I think if you go back 25, 30 years, you would have guys who would hit it big somewhere and then jump off to go to one of the big schools, or even jump off, and go to the NFL. I mean, Jimmy Johnson did that a couple of times, so, I think that that may have impacted why there were such wild swings during that time of a team to be top 5 for a couple years, and they'd fall off for a couple years and then come back or whatever. I think it had to do with some stability with coaching, and maybe you're right, Mark, the style of play. It wasn't so difficult to play catch up in that era as it may appear to be now. You have the best athletes in football today on offense and defense, particularly the skill positions and defensive end and quarterback. You're going to dominate. I mean, those are the 4 or 5 positions: quarterback, wide receiver, defensive end, and cornerback. If you have the best players on the field at those 4 positions, you're going to dominate the game. And it hasn't necessarily always been that way.
And to extend that thought, Tony made a comment a couple of weeks ago about, imagine Joey Galloway playing in the offenses of today, and maybe that's one of the reasons why some of the lesser talented teams were able to make it, is that the offenses allow the separation of the talent. When you got Joey Galloway touching the ball 2 and 3 times a game, well, Ohio State's not going to separate from a inferior manned Illinois team. Maybe a bad example, but you know what I mean? Indiana team, as opposed to today, throwing it 45 times. Well, our talent's going to separate itself rather than we're going to lock it down and play this slugfest and give you guys a chance.
I want to jump into with just recruiting, and I'm not going to say national recruiting is just a new invention over the last 5, 7, 10 years. But I think that if you go back 20, 30 years ago, or whatever the time frame that we want to say is, there was a lot more in-state and regional recruiting. So you weren't necessarily running up with a situation where your top 5, top 7 programs were really going out and getting the best players from across the nation. And by getting these players, you're preventing all these other programs from getting them. So I think that you're getting a little bit more of a glut at the top in terms of your top teams are getting all of the highest rated kids. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to follow that up with success. If you don't develop them, if things don't break the right way, it doesn't matter. You can have a bunch of 5 stars. Mike Mitchell out of the state of Texas didn't work out for Ohio State. So there certainly are 5s that don't always work out. But I just think that the trends in recruiting have something to do with it too. And that's not to say that a team that doesn't recruit a top 5 class can't compete on there. But who are the teams that you're seeing competing for national championships all the years? Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, UGA, those types of programs are there. And I think a lot of that is predicated by a more national approach in how they handle their recruiting.
And combining what Kevin is saying, 30, 35, 25, 35 years ago, teams could only be on national TV so many times. So not only are the teams sticking with their national or their regional footprint, people from outside aren't necessarily seeing, who watched, Iowa, to use them as an example. Like how many people from Florida were watching Iowa? Not many, because Iowa would be on national TV once or twice. Ohio State would be on national TV a couple of times because you're only allowed so many national television spots because frankly, there weren't so many different outlets to show it. And so the national program was probably Notre Dame, and maybe that was it. Whereas everybody else was regional. And now you can be national. Every single game is national TV. Ohio State hasn't had a national TV game in probably almost 20 years, maybe once here and there. But before then, you would see, if you're local, you could see, I think, every Ohio State game. But if you were in Northwest Ohio like me, you might get 5 or 6 and then listen to them on the radio or watch them the next day on the Buckeye replay show. We had to watch it on PBS. Shout out to Channel 27 in Bowling Green, would show it Sunday mornings. And so that's when we would get to watch it and, rewatch the Greg Fry Minnesota comeback, because we had turned that game off on Saturday because it was, got too far gone. And then we tuned back too late and got to see the end.
I watched the whole thing.
Well,
I didn't give up on the Buckeyes.
I didn't have control of the TV. I was the youngest.
Yeah. Raycom and Jefferson Pilot and some of those old players.
Mm-hmm.